Deuteronomy chapter 12, and I'm going to read verses 29 through 32 as our opening text. Deuteronomy 12, 29 through 32. It says, "When Yahweh your mighty one annihilates the nations before you, which you are entering to take possession of, and drive them out and live in their land, be careful not to be ensnared by their ways after they have been destroyed before you. Do not inquire about their mighty ones, asking, how did these nations worship their mighty ones? I'll also do the same. You must not do the same to Yahweh your mighty one, because they practice for their mighty ones every detestable thing Yahweh hates. They even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their mighty ones. You must be careful to do everything I command you. Do not add anything to it or take anything away from it." May Yahweh bless His law, His word to our hearts today. So I was meditating yesterday and today about what to teach on for our new moon service, because I haven't finished studying for my next sermon in the Strong Women series. I want to teach about Mary Magdalene next, but she's going to have to wait for at least another week because I got some more studying to do. So I decided that I'd talk about something that was fresh on my mind, and Sister Tara and I discussed a little bit of this yesterday after the wedding. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, one, the commanded festivals, two, why we don't celebrate certain holidays, and three, where we draw the line at what we do and what we don't do. So this lesson is not meant to go into any particular detail of a specific holiday, but it's rather to look at the reasons why we should shun certain days and accept other days as valid. Now, right from the start, we recognize at this congregation that there are commanded holy days in Scripture. The Sabbath, the new moon, Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, Pentecost, Day of Shoutings, Day of Atonement, Feast of Tabernacles. And we can split them up in different ways, and different groups call them different things, and some of them only call them by their Hebrew names, and that's all fine and well, but you get the point. All of these are commanded days, and they point to great events in the past, in the history of the Israelites, as well as important points in regards to our Messiah. So they not only teach us about things in the past, they teach us about things, if we were there in the day of the Messiah, at the present for those people, and they teach us about things in the future as well. One huge example is the Passover. Passover is my favorite day of the year. That is the day that Yeshua suffered and died on. The Passover. That was not a coincidence. That wasn't just a happenstance. Yahweh orchestrated it to happen that way. And not only did He die on Passover, He resurrected on Wave Sheaf Day. Now, Wave Sheaf Day is not a holy day in the sense of no work, holy convocation, like that. But it is an appointed time that's listed in Leviticus 23 as the day that the priest is to lift up and wave the sheaf of barley as the first fruit offering. And Yeshua is the first fruits of those who have died or fallen asleep. And first fruits, or wave sheaf, is on the third day after Passover. When did Yeshua rise? On the third day, according to the Scriptures. So it should be an absolute that all of these scripturally commanded days are important and should be recognized and observed to the best of our ability. We should always look for ways to fine-tune our worship to Yahweh, to do things better, to do things more perfectly. But we strive to be obedient to His holy days. These are the days that we see men and women and children in Scripture celebrating. These are the days our Messiah celebrated. He is our ultimate example. These are the days that are said to be celebrated in the new heavens and the new earth, as Isaiah 66 speaks of, from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another will all flesh come to worship before me, declares Yahweh. It seems strange to have to say this, but isn't it nice to be able to show someone the days that you celebrate as a believer in the Bible? That's strange for me even to say, but it's always nice for me to be able to do that. So years ago, I was sitting on the bleachers up here at the local ball field And I got into a conversation at one of my children's ball games. I got into a lot of conversations back then on the bleachers at the ball field. Brother TJ was one of my favorite people to get into conversation with. And that led to great things. But I talked to a lot of people there. Got myself in trouble sometimes. But a friend of mine one time sat down beside me during the game, and it was like immediately he said, "Hey, man." I said, "Hey, what's going on?" He said, "We heard that you guys celebrated those Jewish holidays." And I started to shake my head yes. And before I had the chance to explain myself and explain some particulars to him, he looked at me and he followed that up after he said, "We heard that you guys celebrated the Jewish holidays." He looked at me and he said, "Why do you do that?" Now, this was a Christian, a professed Christian. This was a believer. He said, "Why do you do that?" And that question kind of shocked me, especially as I meditated on it later that evening. Because there we have a person, a Christian, who goes to church every Sunday. That's not in the Bible anywhere, by the way. I know that's what everybody does for the most part in the world, but there is no commandment or approved example in the Bible where believers in the Messiah went to church every Sunday or first day of the week. It's just not in there. They attended synagogue on Sabbath, just like their Messiah did. But habitual first day attendance is not in there. Yet this fellow did that, and the same goes for all major Christian holidays celebrated in the church. Christmas is the big one. Yet nowhere in the Scriptures after the birth of the Messiah do we find anyone celebrating Christmas. Easter is another one, and now Easter is a little bit different because Easter is a derivative of Passover. Easter is actually determined by the solar and lunar calendar mixed with the Gregorian calendar. So it's basically an offshoot of Passover. It always happens on the Sunday after Passover, but it's still a distortion of the original Pesach, or the Passover. And no one in the Bible, after the resurrection of Yeshua, no one in the New Testament celebrated what we call Easter today, the way that people celebrate Easter today. It's not in the Bible. So I find it absolutely fascinating that Christians all over the world celebrate these days, along with a host of other days like Ash Wednesday and Palm Sunday and All Saints Day and Advent. Yet nowhere do we find any believer in the Older Testament or believer in the Messiah in the Newer Testament celebrating any of these days. Nowhere. So when someone like myself comes along, and like you all here at our congregation, and others find out what we do, Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles, and all the ones in between, they ask, "Why do you do that?" I want you to think about that. Why do you do that? That's backwards. They should be asking themselves, why do we celebrate and put so much emphasis on days that are nowhere celebrated by believers in Scripture? Why do we do that is what they should ask themselves. Not look at us and say, why do you celebrate the days that are actually commanded to be celebrated in Holy Scripture? So it's backwards. So back to my conversation on the bleachers. My first answer to him was, we celebrate these holy days because, one, they're mentioned as celebrations in the Bible. We can find all of them in the Scriptures. Number two, they are commanded for us to observe. And number three, we see the earliest believers in the Messiah observing the holy days with a newfound messianic significance. In other words, after the Messiah's first coming, followers of Yahweh saw things about the holy days that they had not realized to the fullest extent before the Messiah came. That's because you'll never understand prophecy completely until it is fulfilled. Once it's fulfilled, you'll go back and say, oh, that's what that verse meant. That's what this verse meant. That's how those two verses go together. And I believe it'll be like that for the final coming of Yeshua. I'm not saying we can't learn things about prophecies that are yet to take place by studying the Bible. I'm just saying that once it happens, we're going to look back and say, so that's how it was supposed to happen. That's how all that dovetailed together. What was his response when I told the guy on the bleachers this? First response was, but you're not Jewish. And I then began to explain to him that the holy days were not Jewish feasts, but that they were Yahweh's feasts. They were given at least to the tribe of Judah. That's one tribe they were given to, or the southern house of Judah. but they were Yahweh's feasts. That great text at the beginning of Leviticus 23, the longest detailed chapter about the holy days in the Bible, Yahweh says there in verse 2, these are my feasts, or these are my appointed times. They were given to Israel, all 12 tribes of Israel. That's true, but I went on to explain to him how that even in the Older Testament, the Old Covenant, non-Israelites could join themselves to Yahweh, to serve Yahweh, to love the name Yahweh, and when that would happen, they were considered to be in covenant with Yahweh as well. Honorary Israelites, so to speak. And what did they do when they were in covenant with Yahweh? They observed the same appointed times that Israel observed. Brother Dalton read it at the end of Exodus 12, which is the Passover chapter. It says, there shall be one law for both him that is homeborn in Israel and for the stranger that joins himself to the covenant. And the sign of the covenant was circumcision. We read there at the end of Exodus chapter 12. That's the physical sign of the Mosaic covenant. So I explained to him that whether or not I was a physical Israelite, which I have no clue if I am or not, but that doesn't really matter ultimately. What ultimately matters is that I join to Yahweh and I serve Him, and whether or not I am a thoroughbred Israelite, or if I'm one from among the nations that has a desire to join himself to Yahweh and be part of Yahweh's covenant and fear and love and serve Yahweh, that's what ultimately matters. And I think that's what Yeshua was saying in the Gospels, as it's recorded in 2 of the Gospels, where He said, who is my mother and my brother and my sister? But those who are from the tribes of Israel? No, but those who do the will of the Father. See, so you can be from Israel and not do the will of the Father, or do the will of the Father. You can be from the nations and not or do the will of the Father. Those in the family, those that are kin, attached to the Messiah, are those who do the will of the Father. And the will of the Father is what? Keep the commandments. That's the will of the Father. And I think, if I remember right, I think I pointed him on the bleachers that day to Jethro. Jethro, also called Reuel in the Bible, Moses' father-in-law, Zipporah's dad, where in Exodus 18, Jethro, the priest of the Midianites, acknowledged Yahweh as the greatest Elohim in existence. And then he shared a sacrificial meal with Aaron, Moses, and the elders of Israel. It says he did that in the presence of Elohim. So the priest of Midian. So that's Exodus 18. Now, after I went over this with him, and I just scratched the surface, I probably didn't even go into much detail then as I did now. He shook his head. He said, I find that quite interesting, Matthew. And I told him he could always come to me and ask more questions if he liked. But I stopped right there because I figured I had planted enough seed in the garden on that plot of ground, and I didn't want to overplant or give him too much information to grasp in one sitting. Now, I have a problem with that. When I talk with somebody, I get to going and I forget that they're probably not understanding 90% of what I'm saying. But I get to going fast and I get excited and I want to plant a lot of seed, but sometimes the garden is small and I don't need but just to throw out a handful of seed. And I don't want to overwater either, right? I want to make sure we just water the right amount. But you catch my first point. My first point is we have holy days mentioned all throughout the Bible. And we celebrate all of them here at this congregation. And we can show someone when they ask us, why do you do this? We can say, let me open up the Bible to you and show you why we celebrate this day. And they can read it, whether they accept it or not. That's up to them. But they can read it and they can see, okay, there's a reason why they do that at this congregation. That is very nice that we can point to numerous Bible verses that speak of the days we observe. So, what's the problem with some of the other days? And that brings us back to our opening text in Deuteronomy chapter 12. In Deuteronomy, Yahweh is speaking through Moses to the nation of Israel. And the nation of Israel, remember, it's comprised both of physical Israelites and people from the nations who join themselves to Yahweh to serve and love the name of Yahweh into the covenant. Now, in this particular text in chapter 12, Yahweh tells them, the Israelites, that when He removes the wicked Canaanite people from their lands, the lands that Yahweh is going to give to Israel, that there might be a temptation that takes place. Because the Israelites were fleshly human beings just like us. Fleshly human beings, we always try to wiggle our way around something and justify something. We're often bent on doing things our own way, and there's no different with Israel of old. And Yahweh says you might start wondering and you might start asking some of the people from these nations, how did you worship your mighty ones? We want to do the same to our mighty one. We want to take that form of worship that you did to your mighty ones and we want to apply it to our mighty one. I want you to take notice, this is very important. In Deuteronomy 12, 29 through 32, that text is not speaking about worshiping false mighty ones. That text is talking about taking the forms of worship that were directed to the false mighty ones and then adapting that worship into the worship of Yahweh. Very similar to what took place in, I believe it was Exodus 32, with the golden calf, where they made the image of the calf to represent Yahweh. They were not trying to worship another mighty one. They were trying to worship Yahweh the way that they had seen the Egyptians worship their bull Elohim. This is the Elohim that brought you out of the land of Egypt, they said there in Exodus 32, and they made that calf. And of course that was an idol. They should not have done that. You're not supposed to make an idol trying to depict Yahweh. That's a violation of the second commandment. So the extreme example here in Deuteronomy is that the Canaanites would burn their sons and their daughters in the fire to their Elohim. That's an extreme example, and Yahweh is saying, don't look to that and think you can take that and apply it to me. But it's not just that, it's anything that the Canaanites did in their worship to their mighty ones. Yahweh says, I don't want you to worship me that way. And at the end of the chapter, what does he say? You must be careful to do everything I command you. I'm your mighty one. You do to me what I command you to do. Do not add anything to it or take anything away from it. So Yahweh gives us an outline of how to worship him. Some of the ways that we worship Yahweh is we keep the Passover. That's one way that we worship Yahweh, is by keeping the Passover. We don't work on the Sabbath. That's a way that we worship Yahweh. We set up a temporary dwelling and we live in it for 7 days and we worship Yahweh and we wave the branches of trees. That is a way that we worship Yahweh. One way that we worship Yahweh among many. That's another form of worship. All of these holy days are all ways in which we worship, bow down, pay homage, give honor to Almighty Yahweh. He gives us commandments and we follow those commandments, and that is how we worship our Creator. He tells us to do things and we do it. So here's the problem with some of the days that Christianity observes. And like I said, this sermon is not meant to be a detailed look at heathenism or a pagan practice or anything like that. But the problem is that with days like, I'll use the two big ones, with days like Christmas and Easter, what we have, at least as far as I can see in my studies, and I've studied and restudied and restudied again, and I come to the same conclusion every time, what we have is we have a blending together of some things in the Bible and other things in ancient heathen God worship. So they take something holy, set apart, like the birth of the Messiah in Bethlehem. It's mentioned in the Bible. It's a good thing. It's a holy event. But they take that and they attach it to the winter solstice celebration. And they say Merry Christmas. And then some of them add Ho, 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 Merry Christmas. And talk about this guy that comes down through the chimney, right? Where is all of that in the Scriptures? And then they sing songs about Yeshua being born on Christmas Day. See, this is a blending. This is called syncretism. It's a blending together of things in the Scripture and things outside in pagan practice. You have the resurrection of the Messiah. That's a righteous event that took place on an appointed time in Leviticus 23, but then you mix in a bunny and an egg hunt And it stems from the way the ancient heathens worshipped gods and goddesses of fertility in the spring. It's pretty much very, very easy to prove that. Yahweh says, don't ask the heathen nations, how do you worship your mighty ones? We want to do that to you. Just keep my commandments, he says. So then we go a little bit deeper. We dig a little bit deeper. And we keep studying, and we run into the issue of celebrating days that are not in the Bible, but they don't originate with the worship of ancient heathen deities. And I'll give a couple of examples here. Days like, for instance, Independence Day, the 4th of July, or Thanksgiving, which is an American holiday. Other nations across the earth have their own national holidays, I'm sure, but I'm not versed in those. I'm going to center in on American holidays because that's where I was born and that's where I've lived all of my life. Now, some people cite the end of Deuteronomy chapter 12 here, and they cite this: do what I command you, don't add anything to it or take anything away from it. The same thing is mentioned in Deuteronomy 4. Let's turn to this one actually. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 1 through 2. It says, now Israel, listen to the statutes and ordinances I am teaching you to follow, so that you may live, enter, and take possession of the land Yahweh, the mighty one of your fathers, is giving you. And verse 2 is the pertinent verse. You must not add anything to what I command you or take anything away from it, so that you keep the commands of Yahweh, your mighty one, I am giving you. And so some people say things like, well, Thanksgiving is adding to, Brother Matthew. I even got into a discussion last year on social media where somebody told me in a thread that was pro-Hanukkah, they said Hanukkah is adding to the Scriptures. Purim is adding to the Scriptures. And so what is my answer on this? It was a lengthy discussion, and I want to explain something in Deuteronomy 4 and Deuteronomy 12 where Yahweh says do not add to or take away. Okay, Deuteronomy 4 and Deuteronomy 12 is about adding commandments or taking away commandments. See, Deuteronomy 4 and 12 is not about you can't do anything that you don't find in the Bible. It's about you can't add any commandments to Yahweh's commandments, and you can't take any commandments away from Yahweh's commandments. A great example of this is like there are a lot of churches in history and even in our modern day times that they add standards, church standards, to the commandments, and then they shun everybody that doesn't abide by those standards. Like they get upset if a woman wears jewelry or if a man is not clean shaven or something like that. There is no commandment against wearing jewelry. There's no commandment against a beard. As a matter of fact, there is the opposite of that. But some churches have added those commandments to Yahweh's commandments, and they are in direct violation to Deuteronomy 4 verse 2, where Yahweh said, don't add to my commandments to what I command, and don't take away from what I command. And I could cite numerous examples of this in Christianity or in the church world. But they're in direct violation of Yahweh's law. And the same thing can be said for taking away from the commandments. That's just as much a part of that text as well. And the majority of churches teach, I'll give two big ones, they teach that you don't have to keep the Sabbath day and that you can break the dietary laws. What are they doing when they teach that? They're taking away from the commandments. So they've added their own commandments. They get mad if you don't obey them. Then they take away Yahweh's commandments, and they directly violate Deuteronomy 4 verse 2 and Deuteronomy 12 verse 32. Directly violate the Torah. And of course they say, well, we're not under the Old Testament. You know the whole spiel there. But what they're doing is a direct violation of Deuteronomy 4 and 12. So when it comes to a celebration like, let's use Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication. The word Hanukkah is Hebrew. It means dedication. It begins on the 25th day of the 9th moon, Chislev. We're beginning the 9th moon now. This is the first day, or we're moving into the second day. On the 25th day of this moon is when the Feast of Dedication begins. Is Hanukkah a violation of Deuteronomy 4 verse 2 and Deuteronomy 12 verse 32? Well, if I stood up here at the pulpit and I commanded you to keep Hanukkah, then I would be violating Yahweh's law. But if a believer chooses to observe Hanukkah, is it a sin? No. It's not a sin. And one big reason why it's not is because Hanukkah has good, righteous origins. It stems from the 2nd century BC. You can read about in the book of 1st Maccabees. Brother TJ taught a sermon not too long ago, maybe last Hanukkah, on Hanukkah from the book of Maccabees. And in Maccabees you will see where followers of Yahweh gave their life for Yahweh's law. In other words, they refused to break Sabbath. They refused not to circumcise their sons. They refused to eat swine's flesh. One priest, I believe his name was Eleazar, in 2 Maccabees chapter 7, he would not even pretend to eat the flesh of the pig. He would not even pretend. They said, we'll give you beef and they'll think that you're eating pork, but you won't really be eating pork. And he says, I can't do that because I'll cause my disciples, those that look up to me as the priest, I'll cause them to stumble and wonder, why has the priest forsaken the covenant? And he chose to die instead. Well, this all happened, and then Antiochus Epiphanes, this Grecian king, he comes in and he ransacks Jerusalem, and he offers up a pig on the altar, which is an abomination. And then later on, a couple years later, roughly, Judah Maccabee, Judah the Hammer, and some of the other ones, they come in and they take the temple back over and they rededicate it to Yahweh. And it was an 8-day celebration that they had of dedication. And that 8-day celebration, that does not stem from finding a small cruse of oil in the temple and then it miraculously lasting for 8 days. That might be something that happened, but that is more of a legend. That's not in the book of Maccabees. The reason that they celebrated Hanukkah for 8 days was because they hadn't been able to celebrate Yahweh's feast days. And what was the last commanded feast day? Tabernacles. How long was Tabernacles? About 8 days. Technically 7, but you have the Sabbath right after, so 8 days. And so they said, in commemoration of us not getting to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, we're going to dedicate this temple for 8 days. And of course, when the next year rolled around, they didn't skip over Tabernacles. They kept Tabernacles, but then they also kept Hanukkah. They weren't commanding to keep Hanukkah, but they kept it as a traditional national holiday in Judaism. And you can read about all of this in the books of the Maccabees, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which, by the way, those books were in the original 1611 King James Version of the Bible. Now you tell your King James only friends that, and watch the head spin. 1st and 2nd Maccabees was in the 1611 KJV. And then we'll find out who's really KJV only, right? So the Israelites decided they would dedicate the temple. They were not trying to replace Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. They observed that commanded feast the following year. They were just excited that they got the temple back and the worship of Yahweh back. And their people weren't dying anymore because they wanted to obey the laws of Yahweh. Now, let me say this as a word of caution, or to be careful on where we put our emphasis. Some people I have found, especially in like Messianic Judaism, congregations that are similar to ours, but they got more of a Jewish flair, I guess, to the assembly. Some people I found, they'll put more emphasis on Hanukkah than they'll put on Yahweh's feasts. And I've never liked that. And then there are some people that turn Hanukkah into the Jewish Christmas. They have a Hanukkah bush instead of a Christmas tree. This is true. This is for real. So I do think that some people have tried to use Hanukkah to compete with Christmas, probably because their children see other children celebrating Christmas and we don't do Christmas, and so let's do Hanukkah and let's do it up real big, right? And I think that's something we can do to an extent, at least on Yahweh's feast days. I've given my children gifts on the feast days before, not loads and loads of gifts, but a gift that I wanted them to have, and I buy them and I tell them this is a feast gift from Dad to celebrate Yahweh's holy day because I love you. I think that's okay to do that, but I'm not trying to compete with Christmas at all. But some people use Hanukkah as some kind of a Jewish Christmas. I recognize Hanukkah every year. Most years, I say, I don't want to say every year. I may have missed one or two, but most years in our family, what we've done is we've sat down with the children on the first night of Hanukkah, and we've read through the story in 1 Maccabees 1 through 4. And that's how we celebrate. And I always emphasize to my children that there have been people who loved Yahweh so much and were so dedicated to His law that they would die for Yahweh. That's powerful, especially when we have folks today who want to say that those same laws have been abolished. And also, too, and Brother TJ mentioned this in his teaching, there's nothing wrong with a menorah. A menorah was the candlestick that was in the temple. If you want to light a menorah, that's perfectly fine. Perfectly fine. Now, so in my understanding, I view Thanksgiving, which is an American holiday, in a similar way. I don't use it as a replacement for tabernacles. And some people will point us to Jeroboam's feast in 1 Kings chapter 12, where Jeroboam ordained a feast in the 8th month, likened unto the feast in Judah. We familiar with that text? Let's read that text. Let's go to 1 Kings chapter 12. 1 Kings chapter 12. This is one right here that you need to be familiar with, and mark your Bible, and I think it'll be good for us to read it. 1 Kings 12, beginning at verse 25. Now this is after the split in the kingdom of Israel. All 12 tribes were being ruled together, but there was a schism and there was a split between the sons of Solomon, Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And Rehoboam got the southern tribes, and they split off, and they did their thing in the south, and they had Jerusalem and the Levites and the temple and all of that. But the tribes of Israel, they went with Rehoboam's brother named Jeroboam, and they did their thing in the north. And Jeroboam was worried that his people, the northern tribes of Israel, would get jealous and they would run back to Rehoboam. And so Jeroboam tried to do something different. Look at 1 Kings 12, verse 25. Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. From there he went out and built Penuel. Jeroboam said to himself, the way things are going now, the kingdom might return to the house of David. What is the house of David? Judah. That's the tribe that David's from, is Judah. If these people regularly go to offer sacrifices in Yahweh's temple in Jerusalem, the heart of these people will return to their Lord or master, Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will murder me and go back to the king of Judah. So the king sought advice. And then look what happened. They made 2 golden calves, and he said to the people, going to Jerusalem is too difficult for you. Israel, here is your mighty one who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And he set one in Bethel, that is one of the calves, golden calves in Bethel, and the other one he put in Dan. This led to sin, and the people walked in procession before one of the calves all the way to Dan. Idol worship. Verse 31, Jeroboam also built shrines on the high places and set up priests from every class of the people who were not Levites. Remember, to be a priest under the Mosaic covenant and to serve in the tabernacle, you had to be of Aaronic descent. You had to be able to prove your lineage from Aaron. And Jeroboam said, I'm not going to worry about that. We'll just make anybody a priest. Verse 32. Jeroboam made a festival in the 8th month on the 15th day of the month, like the festival in Judah. He offered sacrifices on the altar. He made this offering in Bethel to sacrifice to the calves he had set up. He also stationed in Bethel the priest for the high places he had set up. He offered sacrifices on the altar he had set up in Bethel. On the 15th day of the 8th moon, or month, the month he had decided on his own, he made a festival for the Israelites, offered sacrifices on the altar, and burned incense. So if you hold a festival on the 8th month, on the 15th day of the month, like the feast that is in Judah, what is that a mimic of? Tabernacles. Because Tabernacles is held in the 7th month, or the 7th moon on Yahweh's calendar. So what Jeroboam did is he didn't keep Tabernacles. He bypassed Tabernacles. He said, we're going to do something different in Israel. We're going to spice it up a little bit so that everybody stays with me. Boy, that sounds just like Christianity. We got to do something a little bit different because we got to get a lot of people into the church. What did Yahweh say? Just stick with what I say. Just keep my commandments. So the key here is that Jeroboam scrapped tabernacles in the 7th moon, and he said, I'm going to go with the 8th moon. Same day, 15th day, but it was the month he devised or decided on his own. He forsook the commanded feast to keep one he devised. And he also worshipped 2 golden calves, and he set up an alternate location for false worship, making priests out of non-Levites. I don't do that here, nor do I place more emphasis on Hanukkah or on Thanksgiving than I do the Feast of Tabernacles. As a matter of fact, we don't even acknowledge Thanksgiving as a celebration here to Yahweh in the congregation. It is an American holiday that does not stem from paganism, as far as I can tell. I haven't found anything in history that would lead me to believe that it stemmed from worship to a pagan deity. We keep it with our family, in our homes. It's a time for family fellowship. We don't celebrate it as a holy day here in the assembly. You know why? Because it's not a holy day. We can be thankful every day. I don't give a Thanksgiving sermon. I don't call for a holy convocation on Thanksgiving and say, look, we got to have a church service this Thanksgiving, and I'm going to give my Thanksgiving sermon. We don't meet here on Thanksgiving Day unless maybe, perhaps, it falls on the Sabbath or a new moon, and then we'll show up. But we'll show up not because it's Thanksgiving, but we'll show up because it's the Sabbath or the new moon. Now, catch this. I know I'm going a little bit longer than I normally go, but stay with me, track with me, all right? If we forsook tabernacles, if we forsook it like Jeroboam, and we tried to keep Thanksgiving in its place, it would be an abomination. It would be a sin to do that. If we set up golden calves at Thanksgiving and made sacrifice to them, it would also be a sin. But all we're going to do, I remember telling one guy one time, turkey and dressing, as far as I know, is clean. Turkey is a clean bird. I don't see it on the unclean list in Deuteronomy chapter 14 or Leviticus chapter 11. Is that right? Leviticus 11? Drew a blank there. So we eat turkey and dressing. We celebrate and fellowship with family, and we're thankful. It's not a commandment. I don't make it into a commandment. I'm not saying that anybody has to celebrate Thanksgiving. That's up to you, just like Hanukkah. Yea or nay. What I am saying is that it is not a violation of Yahweh's law to celebrate either of those. Hanukkah, Thanksgiving, Purim. These are optional days of celebration because, one, they're not commanded, and two, they're simply commemorations of events in the history of either Israel, Hanukkah, Purim, or early America, Thanksgiving. And the same thing would go for 4th of July, which celebrates American independence, basically July the 4th, 1776. Right, Brother John? Declaration of Independence. That's optional. It is not wrong if you choose to celebrate that. It's not wrong if you choose not to. That is your personal preference. So hopefully this lesson has helped clarify some points in regards to the celebration of days, both scripturally commanded days and cultural holidays that do not have pagan origin. Does anybody have any questions? Are y'all not raising your hand because you want to wrap the service up? Or any questions or any comments? If you don't want to ask them out loud in public, you can ask me afterward. But I wanted to talk about something that was fresh on my mind. So I'm going to close up the scriptures now, and we'll do our testimony and prayer request service.